me. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining the HomeKey program overview with the California Department of Housing and Community Development. Today, we're going to go through several topics within our agenda. We'll start with some opening remarks from our agency leadership, as well from the Department of Housing and Community Development. And then we will get right into the NOFA for HomeKey to talk about key concepts, criteria of which we will evaluate, program requirements, CEQA, land use, the application format, and other topics. We'll also hold time at the end for frequently asked questions. And to that, I want to cover a few items of housekeeping. For the webinar participation today, we are so thankful that so many of you are taking time to join us to hear about this program. And to make the presentation responsive to questions that we've already received since launching the NOFA last week, we are including responses to common questions within our presentation. That said, we want to encourage you and feel free to raise more questions, and you can use the chat on the right-hand side of your screen today to enter any more questions that are on your mind. At the end of our presentation today, we will respond to additional questions as time permits. One last piece of housekeeping. If you have any challenges with Microsoft Teams, keeping connected, or anything like that, HCD's IT team is helpfully on board and standing by at the following number for any tech support. That's at 916-823-1103. And I'll repeat it. You can reach HCD tech support at 916-823-1103. Great. And with that, I am so excited to introduce the Secretary of the California Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency, Lourdes M. Castro Ramirez. Secretary?
Yes, thank you, Sasha. Can you hear me? Just one test.
Yes, we can hear you perfectly. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Sasha, and a happy Friday to everyone that has joined us today. We are very appreciative on behalf of Governor Newsom and his entire administration. We are very appreciative to each of you for your participation in this webinar for California's HomeKey initiative. It's so gratifying to see so many cities and counties, public agencies, and others working hard during these very trying times to provide shelter, support, and long-term housing for some of the most vulnerable individuals and families in our state. We're also very encouraged by your enthusiasm to leverage the HomeKey initiative to support and provide housing for people experiencing homelessness. As many of you know, even before this public health crisis, our state was already struggling to provide safe, stable, and affordable rental housing, resulting in a growing number of individuals and families becoming homeless. In fact, California has 12% of the country's population, but we have 25% of the nation's homeless population. And so that's basically 1 out of every 4 individuals that were included in the PIT count, the annual PIT count, that are homeless live here in the state of California. COVID, as many of you know, has made the problem even more complicated. But I want to reassure you that we are working around the clock with commitment and heart to identify innovative approaches to protect vulnerable populations and expand housing and social services. In partnership with the legislature, Governor Newsom allocated $150 million in early emergency funding to help local jurisdictions assist individuals experiencing homelessness. We also, of course, provided technical assistance, guidance, and worked very closely with local government, as we know that these are challenging times and there's, quite frankly, no roadmap or playbook in terms of what we are all experiencing. During this time, we introduced Project HomeKey, the state-led effort in partnership with cities and counties to secure hotels and motel rooms for homeless individuals who are at the highest risk for COVID-19 exposure or contact. Now we are leveraging the success of that effort of Project HomeKey as the framework for response and a launch pad for HomeKey. HomeKey funding will go to cities, counties, and other public agencies to purchase and rehabilitate hotels, motels, vacant apartment buildings, and other buildings, and transform them into long-term housing for people who are experiencing homelessness or at risk for homelessness. Also, HomeKey is people-centered and based on robust input from local partners like you. We took the time, as many of you know, to reach out and get information in terms of what was working at the local level as we began shaping this initiative. There is flexibility to fund local innovative solutions to serve the most vulnerable. And geographic and racial equity is also a centerpiece in HomeKey, with dedicated funding for various regions and the goal of addressing the deeply inequitable impact of homelessness, particularly among Latino and Black communities across California. As you will hear in the next few minutes and over the course of the next few weeks, we will all need to move as quickly as possible. Coronavirus relief funds that have been allocated for HomeKey must be spent by December 30th of this year. I'd like to just take a moment to acknowledge the work of all of the state agencies that have made this possible, specifically Social Services, the Health and Human Services Agency, our Government Operations Agency, and also the Department of Finance. And I'd like to appreciate and acknowledge the stellar job by the HCD team, the Housing Community Development team, led by Gustavo Velasquez, in releasing this NOFA, and also in their commitment, to work with each of you as you develop the proposals over the course of the next few weeks. I want you to know that you are in good hands with the HCD staff. Finally, just our appreciation and our thanks for your participation, not only in this webinar, but also in what you do every single day to ensure that families and individuals have a place to call home. Now, I'd like to go ahead and hand this over to Jeffrey Ross, HCD's Assistant Deputy Director, to tell us a little bit more about HomeKey. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. On behalf of Director Velasquez and everyone here at HCD, I welcome our approximate 900 registered participants on this afternoon's webinar, and we are very excited to provide this overview of the HomeKey program. I am also very excited for you to hear from the various team members that have helped shape and create this program. As you just heard from the Secretary, and last week with the launch of the NOFA, the core components of HomeKey are centered on equity, flexibility, and partnership. To address equity, we have attempted to provide meaningful access and geographical distribution around the state. To ensure that proposals focus on the target population and promote equitable access via eligible uses in other program funds. And that projects actively acknowledge and attempt to address racial disparities in serving those experiencing homelessness and at higher risk of severe COVID-19 illness. To accomplish this, we have tried to create as much flexibility as possible. HomeKey has been intentionally designed not to be one size fits all. We recognize communities around the state have been working hard to address the needs of the target population, and our efforts need to build off of and reinforce that work. We took to heart the input given to our short survey that was sent to local agencies in late June, where we received 200 responses. That communication and our shared experiences helped us design HomeKey to be flexible enough to create immediate housing opportunities, but also allow for long-term investments. We are anticipating that many projects will seek other funding sources to support long-term financing of these sites at points into the future, which will allow for broader, richer investments in projects and project areas. That is great, and we don't want that to be a barrier. To create immediate housing opportunities and to allow for longer-term investments takes meaningful partnerships. And to that end, we have tried to balance expediency with responsiveness, working to create a framework that allows for local agencies to apply as a sole applicant or to have co-applicants, to have single or multiple sites, to provide a spectrum of services both on and off site. Regardless of how many applicants are part of a project or how many sites are involved, we know that partnerships are the cornerstone of this work. And it is not just local partnerships, but a partnership with us at the state. You will hear about all of these details in the coming hour or so as we go through this webinar. With that, I would like to take this opportunity to hand off the presentation to Timothy Lawless, Chief of our Homeless Branch here at HCD, and thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Again, Tim Lawless here with the Department of Housing and Community Development. And I'm going to start us off here with the NOFA overview. And our first slide, I think, nicely lays out some of the key facts about the program. So in terms of available funding, we have $600 million in total funding available, split into two main buckets. The first is $550 million derived from the Federal Coronavirus Relief Fund, which has, as mentioned, a federal expenditure deadline of December 30th, 2020. And just to be clear, what that means for projects involving an acquisition is that escrow must be closed by December 30th. That's an important point, and I wanted to make sure that we hit that right off the bat. Certainly recognize that's a very compressed time frame, and as such, we are committed to moving as fast as we can to review applications and get awards out. The second bucket is $50 million in state general fund, and that has an expenditure deadline of June 2022. So a little more time to spend with that particular pot of funding. Eligible applicants are local public entities, and we'll get to that in the next slide in greater detail. The target population are those experiencing or at risk of experiencing homelessness and impacted by COVID-19, with homelessness defined federally, as you can see there on the slide with the Code of Federal Regulations citation. Technical assistance, that's going to be a critical part of HomeKey, and we'll devote some time to it later on in the presentation. But I did want to highlight that a pre-application consultation with lead applicants is required prior to submitting a HomeKey application with HCD, with local public entities being the lead applicants. These consultations are intended to be a chance for eligible applicants to discuss the project they are considering and to determine what types of TA and support may be needed from the state. And then lastly on this slide, in terms of key dates, we'll cover this more later, but I wanted to ask you to please note that August 13th date, which is the close of what we're calling the priority application period. During this period, we're holding funds for various geographic regions throughout the state so that local public entities up and down the state of California have a chance to apply for the funding. And then after that geographic hold is lifted on August 14th, the application period will remain open through September 29th. Okay, so a bit more on eligible applicants. So here on this slide, we spell out that eligible applicants are cities, counties, and other local public entities, which is actually a term defined in the Health and Safety Code, section 579, and also includes housing authorities and federally recognized tribal governments. We also certainly understand that local public entities may contemplate partnerships to realize their project vision, and as such, the NOFA allows for partnership between local entities and nonprofit or for-profit organizations. And I would also add that two or more local public entities can apply for HomeKey jointly. And then also on this slide, we have a common question we've been getting since the NOFA was released, and that is, does the local public entity need to own these properties? And the answer to that is no. While the local public entity needs to be the lead applicant, the development partner can be the actual property owner. Okay, eligible uses. So you can see a range of eligible uses here on this slide that provide housing solutions for the target population, from acquisition or rehabilitation of motels to acquisitions of other types of sites, to conversions, to purchasing of affordability covenants, to master leasing, and so on. So I think one of the important points here to note is that the $550 million that I referenced earlier is going to be used to support the first 6 uses noted on this slide. And then for the $50 million in general fund that I referenced, that will be used to support number 7 on the slide, which in the NOFA we refer to as a 24-month operating subsidy, just to simplify the language a bit. Because that $50 million has the June 2022 expenditure deadline, the intent is for the $50 million to help support operating costs that occur in those sort of initial first couple of years after an acquisition. And then also an FAQ for this slide, which is, if the applicant acquires a hotel or motel, does it need to be a project room key property? The answer to that is no, it doesn't need to be. It certainly can be, but it doesn't need to be. Okay, eligible projects. Again, you can see a broad range here, including non-residential structures, residential facilities, apartment buildings, shared or scattered site housing, and these projects could be used for either interim or permanent housing. But a key point here is this is not a comprehensive list. Other project proposals are certainly welcome. And again, those pre-application consultations are really the venue where those discussions should be happening with HCD and with our partner state agencies. And we do have, as with the other slides, we have a frequently asked question on this slide as well. And that is, can an eligible applicant acquire a building that is already occupied by residents? The answer is yes, this is allowable. However, please bear in mind that California's relocation law is applicable under these circumstances. Okay, geographic distribution. So as mentioned, we have this geographic hold through August 13th. We know that housing and homelessness are regional issues, and that solutions likewise need to be regional. So as such, we've divided the state into 8 regions listed here on the slide, and the NOFA itself actually lists out which counties are in which regions. So there is a time-limited hold for the 8 regions with the specific set-asides that you can see here on the slide that comprise roughly 80% of the total funding. And then there's also, I don't think it is shown, but it's another 20% discretionary allocation that is not tied to geography. The allocations tied to the regions focus on both the homeless point in time count numbers, as well as severely rent burdened, extremely low income household data, since using this data really allows us to address the eligibility criteria of the program. People experiencing or at risk of experiencing homelessness. And the other important point I would note, while geographic equity is very important, we also need to balance the competing demand to award HomeKey funds quickly due to the expenditure deadline. As a result, any applications received after August 13th, to the extent there's still funding available, will be reviewed without regard to geography. And then there is an FAQ for this slide as well, though it's not on the slide. I'll just go ahead and read it out loud. The question is the priority application period important? Hopefully I've convinced you that yes, it is important, because after August 13th, again, the geographic holds on funds disappear, and any funds left become available to eligible applicants from any region in the state. So like the competition kind of increases, you might say. All right, so prioritization. So the overarching point here that I like to make is that funding made available through the NOFA should be helping the target population right away, or certainly close to it, and should create permanent solutions. So to promote this, we developed a tiering framework within where tier 1 projects are fast-tracked for awards as funds are available. These tier 1 projects are those that can be occupied within 90 days from the time the property is acquired or leased, and where permanent housing solutions are the outcome. This latter point acknowledges that the HomeKey statute requests prioritization of creating new units with HomeKey funds. And then we have tier 2 projects. These are the projects that, while certainly impactful, are anticipated to take longer to occupy and or not lead to permanent housing. Okay, maximum grant amounts. So here our maximum amount relates to a max amount per door rather than an overall cap. So in terms of the max, it's 100,000 per door, and that requires no local match. However, we do recognize that per door costs may be higher in certain communities or for certain properties that are in good condition and not in need of significant future rehabilitation. So for tier 1 projects, the state will consider awards above 100K per door. However, progressively higher match will be required in these cases. In particular, when an applicant goes over the 100,000 per door max, there is a 1-to-1 match requirement. So for example, for every 5,000 requested from the state for HomeKey over the 100,000 per door max, the local applicant must match with an equal amount, 5,000. And then when an applicant requests over 150,000 per door, every additional 5K requested must be matched with 10K from local sources, which is sort of the 2-to-1 match concept. And then we have the 24-month operating subsidy. I did want to touch on that today as well. Again, this is intended to help support operating costs and cannot exceed $1,000 per month per unit, or $24,000 per unit. We've gotten a few questions about whether the per door grant maximum includes this operating subsidy, and the answer is no. The operating subsidy is separate and apart from the max per door grant amount. Okay, and with that, I am actually going to turn it over to my HCD colleague, Kathy Kungu, to continue with the overview of the NOFA presentation.
Thanks, Tim. Yep. Hi, my name is Catherine Kungu. I am a program development specialist. I work on homelessness programs here at the department. Today I'll be reviewing the HomeKey evaluation criteria. So for all applicants submitting an application for HomeKey grant funds, we encourage your teams to review the NOFA. So if you look at the chart in front of you, eligible applicants will submit an application and must meet the program requirements under Section 300. Each applicant will also need to look at the minimum requirements also in Section 304. In addition, if you're requesting a 24 operating subsidy, we're also asking that your application meets the requirements in 307. So for the general program requirements, we're asking that cities counties, and local public entities, including housing authorities or federally recognized tribal governments within California intending to apply independently as a development sponsor or jointly as a lead applicant with a nonprofit or a for-profit corporation. Projects shall serve households experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness, and they do have to meet the federal definition at 578.3, and they also need to be impacted with COVID-19. We encourage your teams to review the development experience for either the interim or the permanent housing projects outlined in Section 304, 305, and 306 of the NOFA. We encourage that your application includes a clear description of the project team, including the partnerships with other entities, and also demonstration of the development team to acquire or rehabilitate and operate the project. So applications meeting the minimum program requirements that I just discussed outlined in the NOFA will also require to meet the minimum 110 points to be eligible for funding. However, in the event of an oversubscription where applicants have the same score and have been received on the same date, will apply the following tiebreaker system. 1, the department will take into consideration the highest score for each project received in the expenditure category. That means we're really looking for projects that have the immediate ability to expend funds by December 30th, 2020. In making a funding determination, from the first category, if we're not able to get to make a funding determination, we're asking the department will grant funding to the project with the highest 2019 homeless point in time count. If we still cannot be able to make a determination based on the applications that have been received, then the department will make a funding determination based on the project that leverages the most HomeKey funds, either from government, private, or philanthropic resources. And then lastly, if we're still not able to make an award determination, then the department may consider additional criteria, including cost effectiveness of the project, whether the project's community impact, whether the project's affirmative furtherance of fair housing, whether it's in an innovative housing type, tenant stability, proximity to transit services, and other amenities. So we do have some questions that we have received. As Tim has mentioned, we have been receiving questions, and this is an opportunity to address one of those questions. So, is the scoring above 110 points important? And the answer is affirmatively yes. Considering that the points are used in the tiebreaker scenarios, if we're oversubscribed, the scoring will determine who will be funded. Next, I will go through the evaluation criteria for Project HomeKey funds. The very first one, as you can see, is the ability to expend funds by December 30th, 2020. Again, for the next couple of slides, especially when I'm looking over the evaluation criteria, I will walk you through the scoring categories, and then also please keep in mind that the department will provide technical assistance as you explore strategies or options to achieve points between the different categories. We will talk about technical assistance in greater detail in the presentation. So please note, with these scoring categories, applicants are not required to self-score. They're not self-scoring sections, but you will have a good sense of where you can achieve points or not. So, with the ability to expend funds by December 30th, 2020, we are looking at the project's ability to provide evidence of site control, or a plan and a timeline to obtain the site control, and that project will receive up to 20 points. To receive an additional 20 points, if the project's development vision, we're asking the project to demonstrate the proposed development vision, identifying the financial regulatory mechanisms that will be used to maintain ongoing affordability of the project. And then again, to receive an additional up to 10 points, the project will need to demonstrate an overview of the planned timeline for any required entitlements, permits, and environmental clearances. For the next category 2, this is up to 40 points. This is where we're asking the applicant to demonstrate the development team's experience and capacity to acquire and operate the project. Demonstration of the team's experience can be found again in the NOFA under the sections 304 and 305. The other thing also that we'll be looking at is a map of how the development team is connected and a description of how the team will work together. Projects can submit an MOU to be able to demonstrate this. The other thing they're also looking for, up to 10 points, is a development, ownership, operation of a project similar in scope and size to the proposed project. So for permanent housing and interim housing projects, we ask you to review the minimum experience requirements in section 304 of the NOFA. The other thing also we're looking at is for the demonstration, if applicable, the demonstration of the range of on-site and off-site supportive services for the target population. For the next evaluation criteria, it's up to 25 points. We're asking applicants to demonstrate how the project will address racial equity, other systemic inequities, state and federal accessibility requirements, and also how they will serve the target population. In your application, we'll be looking for a description and supporting evidence of how the project will address racial equity and inequities, including the local disproportionate impact of COVID-19 by homelessness, race, and other protected classes. We will ask applicants if they could provide a non-discrimination statement per section 311, which references the Fair Employment and Housing Act. The Fair Employment Housing Act is supported by accompanying federal regulations, and all this is outlined in the NOFA. We also will review the extent to which the project exceeds the state federal accessibility requirements. And then we'll review 3 or more years of experience serving the target population. For the last category, this is worth 45 points. This is where your project has an opportunity to receive bonus points if they cannot be able to receive the full points in the first 3 categories that I mentioned. So, for the first one we're looking for the demonstration of your project's community impact and the site selection. And how we'll evaluate it is we're looking for the eligible applicants to demonstrate how the project impact on the community as demonstrated as a reduction of at least 5% of the 2019 point in time count. If the proposed project is a Tier 1 project and requires no rehabilitation, or the rehabilitation and the occupancy can be completed within 30 days after the acquisition. So as you notice, the first one was within 90 days, but if you can do it within 30 days, then you can get the additional 10 points. The next one is if the project is expected to acquire and maintain 100 or more units for the target population. And for the last one, is the project below $350,000 per door? So if the eligible applicant contributes more than the minimum match required, outlined in that was outlined by Tim, then the application will receive 1 extra point for every additional 5% per door contributed to the project. So I'll give you an example. For an acquisition that costs $100,000 per door, the applicant will receive 1 extra point for every $5,000 per door in match contributed, and that project can receive up to 10 points. So here are the additional criteria that you can receive additional points. We will be looking for if the project site is located within a third of a mile of public transit or alternate transit. Again, we're thinking about rural communities that have large geographies. The other thing also we're also looking at is is the project site located in proximity within half a mile or 1 mile for projects in rural areas to essential services. So if you're close to a grocery store, if the project is close to a grocery store, they'll receive 2 points. If the project is close to a health facility that is accepting medical payments, they will receive 1 point. If the project is close to a pharmacy or a book lending public library, that project will receive up to 2 points. So next, I will go over the HomeKey program requirements. So in the eligible uses that the team had just described, we do allow for the purchase of existing residential units and or the affordability of covenants and of affordability covenants and restrictions. For that, we are placing these requirements. These are the following HomeKey requirements. The units must be restricted to the target population for no fewer than 20 years. The application should demonstrate a plan to cover operations and service costs for 5 years and also demonstrate the ultimate use of the site for 10 years. If you're submitting an application for master leasing projects, please provide adequate site control for the project. In addition, we're also looking for that application to demonstrate the range of the on-site and the off-site supportive services for the program participants. In addition, we're also seeking for those projects to provide a plan how they will cover the operations and service costs for 5 years, again, with an ultimate use of the site for 10 years. This program does have a match requirement, and so we're looking for your project to be able to provide a 5-year commitment to provide operating funds for the proposed project. So regardless of whether you're providing an interim housing project or a permanent housing project, we need to see the 5-year commitment. So we do have a frequently asked question around master leasing, and the question is, for master leasing, can we prepay the lease amount? So the answer is no. Direct assistance must be for the time frame of the CRF funds or the 550 funds, which is December 30th, 2020. We do, these HomeKey funds do serve folks who are experiencing homelessness, and as such, we are requesting that projects do follow Housing First and comply with the core components of Housing First. These funds are not subject to Article 34. Again, remember the expenditure period of December 30th, 2020. Article 34 will not be applicable for the HomeKey funds. These funds are subject to state prevailing wage. So there are other program requirements that I mentioned. The accessibility and the non-discrimination requirements, and we are looking for the projects to comply with the tenant screening affirmative market requirements contained in the Americans with Disability Act, Fair Housing Amendment Act, California Fair Housing Employment and Housing Act, and also the UNRRA Act. And we are also seeking that these projects will provide the minimum 5% of units with features accessible with persons with mobility disabilities, and these projects at a minimum of 2% of units with features accessible to persons with hearing and vision disabilities. And these are all these are the California and the federal accessibility requirements. So how will we oversee the funds? Grantees will be required to provide progress reports of the development fund. We will need to know any updates, any substantial changes to the timeline. We have provided all the reporting data, and it's all outlined in the NOFA in section 402. HCD will disperse this fund to cover the HCD will disperse funds to cover critical expenditures incurred from March 1st, 2020 to December 30th, 2020. So we do realize that there is a very short time frame to expend these funds, and we want to get the standard agreement executed as quickly as possible. So co-applicants who will receive an award of funds will both need to sign the agreement. So there is some expediency required from both parties. The signed agreement will spell out the conditions, precedent to the disbursement. In general, though, before we honor a request for funds, we will be looking for the following documents: the payee data record, if that is applicable to your application, the government agency taxpayer form, any outstanding authorizing resolutions, and we have those posted now on our website. A timeline for the site acquisition or evidence of site acquisition, a timeline for acquisition of required entitlements, permits, and environmental clearances, a certification regarding non-application of relocation benefits. Again, these are available from the department upon request, or a timeline for the completion of a relocation plan. So again, the standard agreement that we will provide will set forth the performance milestones, which must be met by the designated deadlines. With that, I will turn it over to my colleague Tony, and she will go over the technical assistance.
Thank you, Kathy. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tani Macedo. I'm a senior policy specialist in our Fair Housing Unit, and as Kathy mentioned, I'll be reviewing our technical assistance, but also some guidance and CEQA exemptions for this project. Next slide. For the SNOFA, we have a requirement for what we're calling a pre-application consultation that must be completed with us prior to submitting your application. We can't emphasize this enough. Section 201 of the NOFA describes the requirement for the pre-application consultation between the eligible applicants and the state. This pre-app consult will assist the department in understanding more about the applicant's proposed project, and that's to assist us in an expedited review of the application once it's submitted. And it's intended to provide the applicant with technical assistance and support from the state. The pre-application consultation will include discussion of the eligible applicant's status and consideration of activities and opportunities for HomeKey. Also any need for guidance or advising from the state to support the proposed activities. Eligible applicants can request a pre-application consultation by emailing our project inbox, homekey@hcd.ca.gov. And we'll reply with a link to a short intake survey. It only takes 10 to 15 minutes, I promise. The survey asks for your entity type, the contact information, a list of your application partners, and where you are in the process. So are you at site ID, in the process of acquiring a site, just getting started? What kind of project are you considering? Is it an acquisition and rehab, master leasing, affordability covenants? Could your site be occupied within 90 days of acquisition? And the amount of technical assistance needed for each of the areas that we're offering, which I'll review in the next slide. Once we've received your completed survey, you'll receive a link with our available time slots. Once you select one, we'll send a meeting invitation. Be sure to include all relevant attendees in the meeting when you register. These are 45-minute sessions to learn more about the project vision and assess what TA, if any, is needed for your project. If there is immediate TA needed for next steps, we'll get you referred at that meeting. At this first meeting, you will have met the NOFA requirements of a pre-application consultation, and at that point, can submit your application online. If you have follow-up requests for TA, you can reach out to us at the HomeKey email box on the slide for additional support or any other questions. So as of this morning, 46 applicants requested pre-application consultations with us. 33 of those have already filled out their pre-application intake forms. 27 have scheduled their consults. And as Jeff mentioned earlier, we've completed 12 consults this morning. Next slide. The coronavirus relief funds released through HomeKey include a rapid expenditure deadline of December 30th, 2020. And for that reason, the state is committed to providing technical assistance to eligible applicants pursuing these investments. HomeKey's technical assistance includes a wide range of services from HCD, the Department of General Services, and other state departments. I won't read through them all, but you can see the list on this slide. And just note that we're tying the TA to the NOFA and application requirements. So the Department of Housing and Community Development, we can offer support on funding considerations, whether they're federal, state, or local philanthropic, land use and planning strategies, or data and analysis support. Through partnerships with HUD, we can cover braiding funding and strategically combining CARES funding with other sources for operating and capital needs. And partnership with the Department of General Services, they can support on site identification, negotiation, considering rehab scenarios, and more. We are tailoring TA based on project needs and interest. We are here to help. We understand some of these are either new concepts in the NOFA or it's just challenging to meet the time allotted to expend the funds. We're also creating TA support documents and posting them on our website. This way, we can get the same information out to all of our eligible applicants. For example, for the Fair Housing and Equity scoring criteria of 3A and 3B, we're developing a TA document of how eligible applicants can document and meet those requirements, including information on tenant screening and affirmative marketing requirements, documenting disproportionate impact of COVID-19 by race and other protected classes, examples of activities of how projects can address racial equity and inequities for their target population, linking to supporting resources, including state and federal accessibility guidelines. And this document will be posted early next week. So question, what common services are requested so far? These services have varied based on proposed projects. And again, they're options, they're not requirements. We really want to drive home, we're here to assist. I want to highlight that we are baking in flexibility into our TA program. As Jeff mentioned earlier, when we're developing the program requirements, DGS and HCD, we conducted the preliminary survey in late June to help us understand the landscape of HomeKey interest. The budget was signed at the end of June, and we translated feedback into the SNOFA, again, to maintain flexibility. And then we've clarified the allowable uses of coronavirus relief funds and the general fund allocations to allowable partnerships and our TA opportunities within the state. We appreciate the questions, feedback, and collaboration from local agencies and housing sponsors we've had to date. Next slide. Our team is capturing questions from our pre-application consultations, and we're compiling them into an FAQ document, which we'll be posting to our HomeKey webpage early next week. This is a living document. We'll be updating it regularly as we receive additional questions through the inbox, our upcoming pre-application consultations, and our TA sessions. You may have noticed we've infused some of the FAQs so far into the presentation, and we'll cover a couple more at the end during the Q&A session. Some feedback we've heard is applicants would like a document listing all the questions in the application, and we're putting those together to post on the website next week as well. If there are other types of supports eligible applicants need, we'd like to hear those too. Like the pre-program and pre-app consult surveys I mentioned, we're using your feedback to shape this program as we go forward to both streamline the application and ensure project success and timely expenditure of funds. Next slide. So now let's review CEQA and land use exemptions. Next slide, thank you. AB 83 includes two powerful tools to assist HomeKey projects to achieve project success: a CEQA exemption and a land use exemption of sorts. To qualify for the CEQA exemption, HomeKey projects must satisfy a number of requirements, including paying for any acquisition exclusively through public funds, using a skilled and trained workforce for rehabilitation and construction, limiting units to persons experiencing or at risk of homelessness, and not increasing the original footprint of the project by more than 10%. The details of the exemption are listed in Health and Safety Code section 50675.1.2. The CEQA exemption is in effect for only a short period. It basically goes away July 1st, 2021. So to use it to satisfy the local agency's CEQA obligations, it's important that a developer include all proposed approvals in their initial application for the project in 2020. The department created a detailed technical advisory to walk you through all the exemptions requirements and to help you develop best practices for your project to get the very most from the exemption. The advisory also includes a Q&A section with a list of anticipated questions such as, what are some examples of activities that may increase the original project footprint and may be allowed under this exemption? Does the Health and Safety Code 50675.1.2 provide an exemption of the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA? Do all HomeKey projects have to utilize the CEQA exemption? Are there any streamlining pathways that may apply? We understand there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to CEQA or permit streamlining. AB 83 includes options, and the CEQA Q&A, which is already posted on our HomeKey webpage, and the technical advisory docs include more options for you to consider as well. So completely separate from the CEQA exemption, AB 83 also provides significant land use streamlining for HomeKey projects. Any project using money from HomeKey funds for any of the purposes listed in the HomeKey NOFA is deemed consistent with all applicable local regulatory plans, including the local general plan and local codes and ordinances, and does not need to undergo any discretionary local permit review or approval processes. The CEQA streamlining Q&A referenced in the prior slide also describes other streamlining processes which could apply to HomeKey projects, including SB 35 and AB 2162. I would encourage everyone who has questions on either CEQA streamlining or land use streamlining to look at the technical advisory. And if you still have questions, please submit them to us at homekey@hcd.ca.gov. We're encouraging folks to submit questions in writing so we can reply with written responses. And as I mentioned, the TA docs are living and will be updated with additional questions as we get them. So with that, I'll hand it over to Mehran.
Hello, good afternoon. Thanks for your time joining this webinar. My name is Mehran Madani, a research specialist with HCD. For this part of the webinar, I'm going to give you an overview of the application process. Next slide. The key points covered through the following slides are: first, you need to view and read the portal tabs, specifically the Files tab that is shown in the next slide. Second, we encourage you to pre-review the entire application before starting the submission. That helps you to identify all required documents, such as those templates provided by HCD or the supporting documents that you need to provide on your own based on provided instructions. Because the submission of this application is a one-shot process, and there is no option to save an incomplete application and come back to complete and submit. It's worth to remind you that if you leave a question unanswered or leave a required space for file attachment blank, the system doesn't let you move to the next step. Also, I need to strongly emphasize that you need to print your complete application before submitting, since the system doesn't let you update your application if you do not print it at the end. Next slide. As you see here, there are required files as template and informational documents under the Files tab. And this is the first application portal, the first page. You can see different tabs. It's good to just search through different tabs, but the most important one is the Files tab. After reviewing all tabs and available documents, click Submit to move to the application process. By clicking Submit, you will see only one option now, when I'm saying now, because when you print your application at the end, you have an option for updating your application later. But now you will see only one option for submitting a new application, and by clicking submit, you will be moved to pre-screening question. Next. And here in the pre-screening question, you need to answer yes to all these questions to be able to proceed with the application process. That means you have already met these requirements. So if you have any problems or questions, you can communicate with HCD team, and through the pre-application consulting sessions, you can clarify those issues. Next. After answering pre-screening questions, the next step is entering application required information, including the application title and number of applicant or co-applicants if you have co-applicants. And then you need to provide address or addresses or contacts for all applicant co-applicants, including primary address and primary contact for each of applicant and co-applicants. Then you will follow questions regarding the legislative contacts, and you will select the appropriate answers from the drop-down window. Next. Under the project tab, first you will see the geographical location, which is auto-populated based on your project address you entered under the application tab. You need to also provide the type of project, the project benefit type or types, and if available, the escrow information. There are instructional notes available for these sections and those questions you have in each tab. Next. Now you are seeing the site readiness or site tab, but it's about site and readiness. Under site tab, you need to select the number of sites you are going to propose in this project. If there is only one or more than one site, then you need to provide a supporting document if you already have the evidence for the site control, or if not, you should submit a plan and timeline for obtaining site control. In the next step, you need to provide site address or addresses if more than one site, and type or types of activity or activities for each site, and an activity narrative according to the instructional notes. Next. And then project evaluation. As Kathy described all those project evaluation criteria and the points, here in the application, you need to provide answers to all evaluation criteria questions. However, some questions do not show any allocated points. Provide supporting documents for questions with file attachment options for any of them. And if you see this required, definitely you need to attach or upload the supporting document. Pay attention to possible sub-questions and drop-down options. Some questions, when you say yes, it goes to the sub-question. Just pay attention that they are linked questions. And some questions are auto-populated. For instance, here, next slide. For instance, question 6A that is linked to your selected site control evidence if you have provided, or if you uploaded a file for a plan or a timeline for obtaining that. And last slide. Next one. There are some other tabs before getting to the print submit tab, such as environmental requirements, budget worksheet, duplication of benefits, and additional information tabs, which are very straightforward to be completed. That's why I didn't bring them in these slides. But the main focus here, I want to say, to be able to modify or update your application, you need to print your application before submitting, as I mentioned before. Otherwise, you have to start over the entire application in terms of having new changes. Now I'm turning to Tim if he wants to add any other points. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Mehran. Very nice job. So the only other thing I would emphasize is that we are committed, and I think Tani mentioned this earlier, we are committed to putting a document on our website that sort of lists out all the application questions and required documents and templates so that interested applicants have that information in advance of being ready to submit an application. But we hope that the presentation that Mehran just gave provided a really good initial sense of the look and the feel of our online application. So I wanted to make that point, and then of course, if you have any questions about the application or anything else relative to HomeKey, certainly reach out to us via the project email, homekey@hcd.ca.gov.
Wonderful. Thanks. So the next part of our presentation, this is Sasha Wasatsky-Kurgan with the Housing Policy Division. And for the next part of our presentation, we're going to walk through some questions that we've already received. Meanwhile, we've been looking at some of the questions which are in the chat, responding to some, and we'll respond to some today as well. As my colleagues have mentioned, we'll be posting FAQs on our website next week. So these won't be the only questions that we answer forever. But for today, we wanted to do a few, starting with interim housing and tiering. Next. Great. So I'll ask the questions, and then I'm going to ask Jeffrey Ross, our Assistant Deputy Director, to answer some of these. So Jeff, do all interim housing applications fit within Tier 1?
So the answer is no. And it's important, and I wanted to take this chance right now to reemphasize the pre-application consultation, because as we mentioned earlier, we've done 12 of those so far. We have several more already scheduled. And this is exactly the type of question that we're going over with communities and public agencies when we are in that consultation. So the answer is no, not all applications will fit into Tier 1, because sometimes you have a really worthwhile activity that cannot meet that 90-day occupancy standard, or you're really trying to make sure that you provide the appropriate level of congregate housing and sheltering, but you might not have the details worked out on linkages to permanent housing. So while we recognize that those are absolutely important and appropriate types of activities to be supported, they might not fall into the Tier 1 kind of property.
Great, thank you. Another question that we've been receiving is about permanent housing. In the NOFA, does permanent housing mean permanent supportive housing, or PSH?
The answer is no. We were very intentional on this. I think that it's very common when we think of trying to serve folks that are homeless and are at risk of homeless, that a lot of times we are trying to create a service-rich environment that a lot of times is a permanent supportive housing type. But it is appropriate and absolutely okay for us to cover the entire spectrum of housing opportunities for the target population. And so, that can include permanent supportive housing, but it does not need to exclusively be that. We're really looking to understand what are the tenant services and neighborhood services that are also integrally important to these projects.
Wonderful, thank you. And a plug for our technical assistance on that last piece. as you're thinking about investments and wondering what services might be in the neighborhood where you're going to acquire a building, our team has already collected a lot of data to talk about existing community services that might help on the scoring side, but also just to talk about the web of services that are needed to support long-term stability. So if that's technical assistance that would be useful, that's something that you could reach out to us about. So next slide, we're going to start covering some of the questions that are from the chat. We've received some great additional questions today, and I want to thank you all for writing. There's a good chance we're not going to make it through all of them, but we'll try and make it through some. As a reminder, after today, the FAQs will be posted on HCD's website, and you can continue to raise questions either in the pre-application consultation or by sending to our email address, homekey@hcd.ca.gov. So a few more questions for you, Jeff. Is from someone from a county. There are some folks marked as anonymous. Is our county able to submit multiple projects for HCD's consideration?
Yes, the answer is absolutely yes. But again, to point out that it's really critical that as folks are going through this process, you're really approaching each project application individually. It's okay to have a very broad vision and you're trying to coordinate activities, but given the timelines that we are all trying to operate in, when you are ready and you have the ability to respond and answer to all the questions in the application, and that doesn't mean that you have to have all the documents. As we tried to point out, there's times you're not going to have documents, and we're just asking you for you to share your vision, to give us a timeline, let us know when you're going to have that material, and that can follow. When you're ready to answer yes to all those and submit the application, because right now we have the geographic set-asides, and that allows for the Tier 1 projects to move expeditiously and for awards to begin to happen. Once we get past the August 13th deadline, that's where the set-asides go away, where the competition ramps up because incoming applications are going to be going against everyone from around the state. The scoring becomes a little bit more critical in that process. And so part of, again, the pre-application consultation is for us to be able to help walk through what you're trying to do, how you're trying to do it, to help provide some of that guidance, to help link you to technical assistance, so that when you do apply for more than one project as any entity, that you're able to do so as expeditiously as possible.
Great, thank you. So let's talk more about applications, or rather applicants. What if I'm a county that has a development partner? When do they become listed as a co-applicant?
So if you've already gone through your procurement process and you have those arrangements in place, the key criteria is that the public entity needs to be the lead applicant. You can then list your partners as co-applicants and provide all that material. But if you haven't gone through your procurement process and you're intending to do so, just let us know what your process is going to entail, the timelines you're anticipating. And as we discussed, you must submit a complete application the first time. But as long as you've printed it out and you have your application name, your application number, you can go back in and then provide supplemental information, as in who your co-applicants are going to be. That information can trail, because again, we don't want you to wait to submit your application for all of these things to absolutely be in place. Let us know your process, keep us informed. We truly mean that we want a partnership between us and your organization, so that way we're all moving with the same vision. We can evaluate in real time and really move expeditiously to get awards out and to get these projects in the ground.
Wonderful, thank you. So you've mentioned, and we understand that there's an expenditure deadline of the CRF funds by December 30th of this year. We understand that that applies to acquisition, but what about for the rehab? Can these funds that we get awarded be escrowed and drawn down to pay for the rehab over time if we can't complete it before the end of the year?
That answer, and we're going with the strict interpretation right now. So that answer is no. So when you're thinking of the December 30th deadline, please think of Cinderella and that these funds turn into a pumpkin at midnight and they will disappear. If you have not completed your activity, if you have not expended those funds, and that means a real expenditure, not a commitment, these funds will disappear. And so part of what we're trying to work with in the communication that we're having is that we really want to understand what you're trying to accomplish using these dollars and your timelines, because we will help evaluate and advise as to whether or not you will have a real clear opportunity to be able to use those funds by that deadline, because we don't want anyone at the end of the day to wake up on New Year's Eve and say, uh-oh, we thought we were going to expend that and we didn't. So that is a real hard deadline. That is part of the federal requirements that we're all under, and it's not something that we are able to change.
Thank you. That's helpful. So let me follow up on that question. What if I can acquire the building before the end of the year and I could use that building for interim housing in my community? But in order to complete the rehab that would be needed to make it permanent housing, that's going to happen at a later date. How are you all thinking about that in the NOFA?
We actually designed the NOFA for that exact scenario. So we know that a lot of the properties that our community partners are looking at up and down the state are strategic targets of opportunity for us to help individuals today, but they might not be the building stock or be in the condition that we want for the long term, for the next 20 to 55 years. And that's okay. We can occupy them today. We can serve individuals today. And one of the reasons we've asked for a 5-year operating subsidy as a requirement is that we know that a lot of these projects can operate in that interim space as an actual long-term project is developed, whether it's substantial rehabilitation of the existing facility, reconstruction, or full redevelopment. That's okay. Just let us know what your intent is, and then at a certain point, you're going to execute that vision. And at that point, that's where other requirements, because you're going to be braiding in other dollars, are going to come in. The 55-year restrictions will likely kick in at that time. If you notice, unless you're going to permanent immediately, we don't have a 55-year restriction because we are anticipating that some of these more permanent projects will grow out in the future from the activities that we're doing today.
Great. That's very helpful. So with such an intense expenditure deadline, and we see on the time frame that applicants will be notified by October of this year, will that all be one batch notification for the applications, or will you be letting anyone know sooner?
So our goal, and I think it's probably shared by you on this webinar, is for you to know your awards as soon as possible, and for us all to know that progress is happening rapidly. There is the possibility that some awards will come in a little bit slower and that we won't have full allocation till a little bit later. But in the event that happens sooner, that is what we are hoping for. And likewise, we also know that there's a chance that some projects could potentially fall out and not be able to be completed. What we're really looking for is to make all final awards by that October deadline, meaning that most of the awards would have been done well before then. Because once we get to October, we're about 90 days from the funds going away. And so we understand that we're asking folks to do a lot of things, and 90 days isn't a lot of time. And so that's where that October deadline or that October reference comes from. And it's really for those last few projects that we're trying to make sure that we don't leave any dollars unallocated are going to come in, but the vast majority of awards should have occurred well before then.
Great. Jeff, I'm going to give you maybe a quick break so that you don't need to answer questions so quickly. And we're getting a common question about whether or not the webinar slides and recording will be posted. And yes, we will be posting the slides and the recording of this webinar on our HomeKey website next week. Thank you all so much for joining. We'll keep answering questions and answers, but I just wanted to cover that briefly. So Jeff, we have another question. What if a locality has a vacant piece of land? We saw that manufactured housing or perhaps modular construction or maybe other housing types might be able to be delivered faster than we can do a stick-built model. If we could occupy within 90 days, could that work for a tier 1 project? And is that an allowable use at all?
The answer is yes. That is an allowable use and is absolutely something that was contemplated as being allowed for the NOFA and the use of funds. Again, the key is for us to provide housing that works for various communities and that really serves people today. And so that is one type of project that is absolutely allowed and could be used in various communities up and down the state.
Great. We're getting a question about whether or not the applicant could choose to do any green amenities, solar or anything like that on their site. How does the department feel about those types of improvements to existing buildings?
So again, as long as we're serving the target population, we're going to be occupying the site in 90 days or less. We're in the tier 1 strategy and area. Then the types of improvements, the minimum we want, right, is habitability and accessibility. But again, getting to what do we really want for the folks that we're trying to serve? What do we want for our community? If we have the ability to reach higher and to do some of these additional types of work that really do provide a benefit to the residents in the surrounding neighborhood, that is something that we would be open to. We're going to want to understand what you're trying to do. We're going to want to work with you, but that's not something that we're going to say no to. We're just going to want to be able to really work through what your vision is and how that works to make sure that we are creating a sustainable project that is sustainable for the residents and for the long term.
Great. Thank you. We're having a question about geographic distribution. And specifically, how or will the department make efforts to spread resources to all counties within the regions?
We are absolutely committed to try and have as much geographic equity as we can, and that's why we have the 30-day hold. But we also have this tension of expediency. And so we did hold back 20% of the funds to try and allow for some pressure release in this area and to make sure that really good projects that can be done can be progressed. But it doesn't mean that we can guarantee every county is going to have a project. Again, $600 million is absolutely wonderful, and we are excited to have this money to help serve the folks that we are trying to help. But we also, I think, all know that in California, $600 million won't stretch to every location that we want to be able to provide assistance to, and that has a project that might be a really successful one.
Okay, wonderful. So that might lead us into some more questions on match and appraised value. I have a feeling you knew that these were coming. Could you please give an example of the one-to-one match? What would that look like if there's a gap of $20,000 per door? Does the locality need to come up with 10,000 to the state's 10,000?
So if you have a per door cost of $110,000, we are over that $100,000 threshold, and so we are in the one-for-one match category. So to get to 110,000, that means that the locality would have to provide $5,000 and that the state would kick in then an additional $5,000. So the state contribution would be $105,000 of that $110,000 per door price. And I want to also point out, because I don't believe we actually did it in the presentation, we're addressing doors in terms of acquisition, because we understand when we're buying a hotel or motel, the doors are the existing condition. What might be the existing project after acquisition and some rehab? The units might be less than the doors that we acquired. And an example would be is it's not uncommon for us to have to remove units to add kitchenettes and sinks and that type of work. So it's not uncommon to see for every 3 units, you actually get 2 units on the backside because 1 unit was removed to create the living space that we need for accessibility and amenities for it to really become a habitable residential property. And so I just want to point out that is you see door and unit in the NOFA and in our presentation. Door refers to what you're purchasing. Unit is what you're going to be inhabiting on the backside.
Great. So we'll take one more question on the total cost per door, and then we might go to appraised value just for the preview. So while we're looking at this slide, could you please confirm the total cost per door that the state grant is capped? And what if, because I'm in a high cost area, the actual acquisition costs more than that amount?
It is important to note that at no time in the NOFA did we cap acquisitions. What we've tried to do is hold harmless both more rural areas and our high cost areas as we would be evaluating project types. And we understand that in some areas, and certainly if we're trying to buy properties in better condition, the costs are going to go up because the rehabilitation costs on the backside are going to go down. And so we have a maximum state grant amount per door that is $200,000. What that means is that the minimum per door cost in that category then is the $350,000. It could be more. You could go up to $400,000 a door. And in that scenario, the lead applicant and its partners are providing more funding to be able to close that difference and to be able to make that acquisition a reality. But we do have a tiering scheme in place to allow for the higher cost properties, but it's also, we're trying to be mindful in this process to try and also provide some abilities to help push down cost a little bit as well.
Great, that's helpful. So this next question is about where the cost may be lower. Let's say there's a viable property that appraised lower than the selling price, but it still falls within the $100,000 per room threshold. Could I include in my application some rehab costs to still get that $100,000? What would that look like?
And that's where we want to know what you're trying to do in terms of the project and your actual timelines, and can you get that rehab done before the deadline? To the extent that the acquisition and rehab or repair, it's probably more repair when we're thinking about the timelines that we're talking about. If you can get that done, then that can all be part of what the award is. And so yes, your per door acquisition cost, say, was $50,000. You might have $25,000 of per door repairs that you're going to do because you're replacing different things like doors, and you're adding grab bars and just different work that can be done relatively quickly, and you're not changing systems, knocking out walls, things like that could drag longer than the December 30th deadline. Those costs are eligible costs. They can be added to the grant amount, and that would be part of what the ultimate grant award would be.
Great. Okay. Let's see, I'm flipping through questions. Thanks everyone for submitting so many great questions. As I mentioned, we will be translating some of these into more written scenarios. Others we will probably talk with you when you do your pre-application consultation. I have a question about, again, back to eligible applicants. What if there's a county Department of Social Services? Would that public entity count as a public entity?
The department alone isn't its own entity. It's not an agency unto itself. So it would need to come through its parent county, and the Board of Supervisors would need to be authorizing it. but certainly they can be the lead for the county if that is the desire. So we just want, we ask, and again, this is a good opportunity to point out, we are also recognizing that you might not have all the resolutions that you need immediately up front when you apply. We just want to know the path that you're going to take to get to those resolutions, and they can follow. But just have in mind that the eligible applicant must be a local agency, and you must ultimately get a governing board, a resolution and approval. And so in that case, that's a department that needs to go up through the parent county, just like a department in a city would need to go through its city council.
Great. So let's take that further, and let's say that that same county becomes the applicant, and they're going to partner with a nonprofit. Must the public entity be the lead applicant, or could we switch and have the nonprofit be the lead and have the county be the co-applicant?
No, the lead applicant must always be an eligible applicant, which is a city, county, or other local public entity, which includes housing authorities or federally recognized tribal governments. So that is non-negotiable. The lead applicant must be that. Now, in terms of who is the primary in terms of working on different aspects of the project, who ultimately owns the property or the project when it's done, those can go to different entities and would be recognized through the standard agreement. But the lead applicant needs to be that local entity, public entity in that case.
Okay, great. We have some questions about the target population and eligible applicants who will live on site in these investments over time. And you mentioned that there is a HUD CFR definition, and I think we talked about next week providing some of the helpful guidance that HUD has shared about how to verify whether or not people meet that definition. So that's forthcoming on our website next week. But we're bound by the HUD definition, and it seems like the person who raised this question certainly understands that. But they're wondering, does that definition need to apply to every unit on site for a HomeKey property? Or could they do something that has mixed eligibility, essentially that some units would not be serving people at risk of or who had been experiencing homelessness?
At this point, we're under a strict interpretation that if we are acquiring a site, it is for the target population, which means everyone on that site must fit that definition of target population. And so at this point, we don't have the ability to have that mix. And that is why relocation is an eligible expense. And so at this point, until we were to get differing guidance, primarily ultimately coming from the Treasury, that is the interpretation that we're bound to follow.
Great. Wonderful. So this is an exciting example from an applicant who has already acquired a building. And they're wondering if any of the HomeKey funds could be used for ongoing construction to finalize construction and expedite occupancy, so long as it serves the target population.
So not knowing the details, this would be a perfect candidate for that pre-application consultation, but theoretically that is possible, and it wouldn't, our deadlines would be tied to not necessarily acquisition at that point, but it'd be at the point that we execute a standard agreement. So it's not an absolute yes, but theoretically it is an allowable use, and the details would ultimately tell us what we can and cannot do.
Okay. Great. We have a couple questions on the match, specifically on actually the operations match. Does the 5-year operational commitment need to be from the lead applicant, or could it come from a project partner?
I think it certainly could come from a project partner, could come from various sources, but what needs to happen is that structure needs to be reflected within the standard agreement, and that is how we're going to be holding folks accountable for meeting those match requirements. Because again, we're happy for partners to be part of the applications, but the lead applicants are the ones that are initially coming to us and are submitting projects. And so the structure by which they're going to be able to meet that threshold is the structure that we need to have high confidence will actually occur.
Okay. So another question on the operations and services cost. Since the applicants need to have 5 years lined up, but this person who's raising a question is assuming that that $50 million of general fund may not be available by the time they submit their application. How should they present that in their application? Can they present an optimistic plan and also a backup plan, or what would you like to see?
So I think it's critical for everyone to understand that while you may apply for the 24-month operation subsidy, there's not necessarily a guarantee that the money will be there, right? There you might get a subset of that. The requirement is that every application must show a 5-year obligation to provide ongoing operations. The goal would be to extend as much of the 24-month operating subsidy to as many applicants and projects as possible. But anything less than that 24 months must be made up by the applicant.
Great. Now there's a specific question that I think might be better for us to do in the pre-application consultation. So I'm just going to take this from more a conceptual standpoint right now. We see in the NOFA that there could be allowable expenditures going back to March of 2020 when the coronavirus relief funds were first expended. How will HCD review those? Do we go under the same application criteria? Is there anything different that we need to consider in our application?
So we know that that is an eligible expenditure. And right now, we would need someone to come through the same process. So that absolutely, I think we would get a lot of useful information in the pre-application consultation, and that certainly would be the first place we'd begin that conversation. And then from there, we'd understand how to define what the eligible expenditures are, and then that would be what we'd be working towards to get to an agreement where we could then expend funds.
Great. That's wonderful. Let's see. Sorry, I don't have another question queued up immediately, but I am working on it. If an applicant leverages other funds on a project where no match is required, how would that work in the scoring? Essentially, what if the applicant needs less from the HomeKey program?
So to give a concrete example, if you could collect the 100,000 but are not going to collect the 100,000 and you're going to provide additional money to the project, and so you're coming underneath there, we did provide a scoring mechanism by which every 5%, so in that case it's every $5,000, you would get additional points. So assuming that we are coming down to tiebreakers and we are looking for the way to determine whether or not a project, what project is going to get awarded, that could be a significant tiebreaker in terms of that level of critique.
Okay. We're getting a couple of questions on relocation, specifically with the scenario of a building being acquired where there's some number, could be a small number or a high number of existing residents that don't meet the vulnerable population, or the HUD CFR rather. Could that building still be acquired? And could that building still be acquired?
The answer is yes. The question that the community and the applicant need to answer is that a worthwhile endeavor to do? And that's not for us to decide. That is for the applicant to make that decision. We're not going to second guess that. But it's an important realization that some really good properties might have some folks in it, but what that means for those individuals that are in those units and what that means for the community the community needs to make that decision and then present that to the state for us to be able to go through the process.
Great. That person followed, or a separate person followed up, given that relocation requirements sometimes take time. Should that consideration be included in the application about the potential risk to the timeline?
Absolutely. So again, the 90 days to occupy is how we determine tier 1 versus tier 2. And that's a very important consideration. It's also a consideration of how real can the property be acquired and occupied overall, and where does it fit into that? And then it gets into other aspects of scoring and criteria. So it is something that needs to be weighed heavily, and the applicant really probably needs to have a very clear path to do that in a way that can articulate that we're meeting all the different requirements that were set out in the NOFA.
Great. If I'm considering, if I'm an applicant who is considering a choice between interim housing and permanent housing, I wonder how might that affect my rehabilitation plans? Specifically, I wonder about some needs to have private bathrooms or kitchens. And Jeff, if you don't want to take this one, I'm happy to.
I think that what's critical to think about is both, as long as you're doing interim with a tie to permanent housing on the backside, it's a tier 1 type of proposal. The NOFA allows for a longer term redevelopment plan to occur. So the question that the applicant really needs to be able to answer is what is the immediate priority that they're trying to address, and how does that then impact their longer term goals? And the NOFA allows for a really wide array of different proposals and thoughts and projects to occur. And so that shouldn't be a barrier for someone to be able to come in and apply and work through. We want to understand your vision. So what are you trying to do and when is the driving force? And that needs to be articulated. And again, that's where we begin to ask those questions in more detail in the pre-application consultation, and they can follow up in technical assistance.
Great. This next one, kind of similarly about thinking about a long-term project and maybe not having everything figured out today, but knowing that there is a project vision in mind. And then in order to complete and actually occupy the housing, the applicant needs to finish procuring a provider. They want to confirm that submission of the application before completing that procurement for the provider is allowable. And what might I say in my application to describe that?
So it is allowable because the lead applicant assuming the lead applicant knows that they can get the property in question, right? That is the driver, I think, for the lead applicant. In terms of still having to go through procurement, what they're going to want to say is that, have they started that process? Where are they in that process? And what does the process entail? And when will they conclude it? That's the information that's really critical for us to know, so we can know when to expect a co-applicant to come on board or a partner entity that will help inform the final structure of the project and what it will look like. And then that's how we can get to a point where we can ultimately define the project and the expectations within the standard agreement and release funds and move forward.
Perfect. So we're getting a few different iterations of questions about which projects might require the 55-year affordability covenant. What's the difference between that and the 5-year operations commitment? And then we see another requirement for 20 years. Could you help us walk through the different requirements there?
So if you're purchasing a restricted covenant, generally what we're saying is that you must have an obligation of 20 years there. With projects that you're looking to do an interim use with links to permanent housing in tier 1, or just an interim project in general, that would be tier 2 that ended up getting funded. You have to have a plan of operations and commitments for 5 years with the ultimate plan to operate it for 10 years. That's the requirement. To get to 55 years, that's an anticipation that at some point you're going to braid in other funding that, much like a very typical affordable housing project, where you're going to use a source of funding that triggers that 55-year restriction. And so that's where that comes into the project. For projects that are immediately converting and are really high quality and are going to have that permanent piece right up front, they may trigger the longer time periods. But absent knowing the details of the project and what's fully going on, that's something that's more of an individualized proposal and discussion.
Right. That's helpful. So this sounds like an iteration of what we've already said, but I just want to affirm about costs that have already been incurred, where the question is, we own the project and can complete the rehabilitation and occupy by the end of the year. As one may submit the application and wait for award, could we get reimbursed if we had to incur some costs before our award in order to meet those timelines? And I'd give you a lead-in that this probably needs to be discussed in the pre-application consultation.
It absolutely does. But I think what folks are getting to in these questions is that we know from March 1st to December 30th of 2020, the CRF funds are potentially allowed to reimburse eligible activities and costs. And so we would need to define what those were, and assuming that they're in those dates and they're for the benefit of the target population, they are potentially subject to reimbursement.
Right. Okay. Let's go back to expediency as our time frame is winding down. We're almost done with questions. I want to end on how important it is to submit applications. So let's say that I am a county or a city and the next commission or council meeting isn't happening until August 12th. Can I submit my application with the authorizing resolutions to follow if I'm already authorized to submit an application under my budget?
Yes, the answer is yes. If you have the ability to submit and you have a project that you can answer all the questions to, and you have all the information or planning documents necessary to submit, then we highly encourage you to submit as soon as possible. The other material can follow, and that is something that we're really trying to emphasize in all of our pre-application consultations, is that once you've had the consultation, you are eligible to submit. And so if that was the only thing preventing you from submitting, then please hit the button and submit.
Great. Now let's say that I get my project in before August 13th, but the program is oversubscribed and my project doesn't get funded. Will I still hold my place in the queue? Will it be considered as part of the next component of your review?
It will hold its place in the queue, and that's why the date stamps and getting projects in quickly is important, because that is a really important piece of the application process. We're then going to start looking at the tiebreakers and the ability to meet all the different thresholds. And so assuming that we start working through all those pieces, we're going to, where we have the ability, we might be oversubscribed in some geographic areas and not in others. We could be oversubscribed everywhere. We don't know. We're still pretty early on in this process, but we'll probably know within a few weeks. But what we will be doing as we go through pre-application consultations and technical assistance, and folks are following up with questions, if we will be conveying how that is looking for geographies and or overall within the program. So that way folks understand where they probably want to be prioritizing, given where funding is at and our ability to support applications and projects.
Wonderful. With just a few minutes left before the hour, I think we might be off the hook for questions, but I want to wrap up with a few points. First, I want to thank you, Jeff, for taking all of those questions. Expert navigation on the fly. So we are receiving some questions that we're not going to have time to address today. Our team will start reviewing them and quickly and translate as many of the answers as possible into a standalone document. Those will be our frequently asked questions, or FAQs. We will post the FAQs on our website next week. We intend to continue updating our FAQs as we have more questions to answer. So continue to raise them, but we are documenting everything that was put into the chat today. There was a lot of consistency. I will say that there were a lot of very specific questions and scenarios about master leasing, some that took very different directions. We will certainly include master leasing in our FAQs. There were also some questions about the fair housing components, those that are required, like the minimum accessibility, versus the point scoring components, which is doubling the accessibility requirements to 4 and 10%. So we will also, and I'm going to reiterate something that Tani said earlier, our fair housing team is working on a TA document about how eligible applicants can document and meet some of the requirements, as well as some of the scoring options. That will be posted, we expect, next week. If you have more detailed questions about some of the fair housing or equity considerations or anything else that's in the application, please feel free to reach out to us. We hope to create as many standalone documents that can answer questions broadly, but also sometimes when we're in the middle of a pre-application consultation, that's when we're really hearing the need for technical assistance. So our team will continue to commit to listening for the types of TA that may help you submit an application or finish your project before the end of the year. But that said, you are welcome to ask us for specific support. We will let you know if we can do it. We will try to make as many referrals as we can to get you supported. There were some other questions about CEQA and land use. I would want to point out that on the HomeKey website, HomeKey page that's on the HCD website, we already have a questions and answers document about CEQA, some of the land use and permit streamlining opportunities, as well as a link to the Office of Planning and Research's technical advisory on CEQA. There are a lot of options. As we mentioned earlier, there's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach, but we're happy to talk to you about it. We appreciate so much all the questions that you've raised today, the feedback that you shared with us before the NOFA was released, the collaborations from local agencies, housing sponsors, the enthusiasm that we see from all of you to continue to find solutions to address and end homelessness in your communities is inspiring, to say the least. We are here to meet you with that enthusiasm. You have a broad team that touches all divisions within our department, and we're here to help you along the way. You can stay in contact with us on all of the things that are posted on the page now. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. If you're into social media, you can continue to reach out to us at the HomeKey website. We do hope to talk to you soon. For anybody who hasn't scheduled their pre-application consultation, please reach out. We're prioritizing those meetings, and we hope to talk to you again soon. Thanks everyone for joining.